Hannibal against Rome, 264 to 202 BC. 1. Carthage. Some 1100 years before our era, the inquisitive traders of Phoenicia discovered the mineral wealth of Spain. Soon a fleet of merchant vessels plied between Sidon, Tyre, and Byblus at one end of the Mediterranean, and Tartessus at the mouth of the Guadalquivir on the other. Since such voyages could not then be made without many stops, and the southern shores of the Mediterranean provided the shortest and safest route, the Phoenicians established intermediate posts and trading stations on the African coast at Leptis Magna, now Lebda, Hadrumetum, now Sus, Utica, now Utique, Hippodioritis, now Bizerte, Hippo Regius, now Bonn, and even beyond Gibraltar at Lixus, south of Tangier. The Semitic settlers at these posts married some of the natives and bribed the rest to peace. About 813 BC, a new group of colonists, perhaps from Phoenicia, perhaps from expanding Utica, built their homes upon a promontory 10 miles northwest of the modern Tunis. The narrow peninsula could be easily defended, and the land, watered by the Bagradus, now Majerda River, was so fertile that it quickly recovered from repeated devastation. Classic tradition ascribed the founding of the city to Elissa, or Dido, daughter of the king of Tyre. Her husband having been slain by her brother, she had sailed with other adventurous souls to Africa. Her settlement was called Kartadasht, New Town, to distinguish it from Utica. The Greeks transformed the name into Carchedon, the Romans into Carthago. The Latins gave the name Africa to the region around Carthage and Utica, and followed the Greeks in calling its Semitic population Peni, that is, Phoenicians. The sieges of Tyre by Shalmaneser, Nebuchadrezzar, and Alexander drove many wealthy Tyrians to Africa. Most of them went to Carthage, and made it a new center of Phoenician trade. Carthage grew in power and splendor as Tyre and Sidon declined. The strengthened city drove the African natives farther and farther inland, ceased to pay tribute to them, exacted tribute from them, and used them as slaves and serfs in its homes and fields. Large estates took form, some with 20,000 men. In the hands of the practical Phoenicians, agriculture became a science and an industry, which the Carthaginian Mago summarized in a famous manual. Irrigated with canals, the soil flowered into gardens, cornfields, vineyards, and orchards of olives, pomegranates, pears, cherries, and figs. Horses and cattle, sheep and goats were bred, asses and mules were the beasts of burden, and the elephant was one of many domesticated animals. Urban industry was relatively immature, except for metalwork. The Carthaginians, like their Asiatic forebears, preferred to trade what others made. They led their pack mules east and west and across the Sahara to find elephants, ivory, gold, or slaves. Their immense galleys carried goods to and from 100 ports between Asia and Britain, for they refused to turn back, like most other mariners, at the Pillars of Hercules. It was presumably they who, about 490 BC, financed Hanno's voyage of exploration 2,600 miles down the Atlantic coast of Africa, and the voyage of Himilco along the northern shores of Europe. Although their coinage was undistinguished, they were apparently the first to issue the equivalent of a paper currency, leather strips stamped with signs of value and accepted throughout the Carthaginian realm. Probably it was the rich merchants, rather than the aristocratic landowners, who provided the funds for those armies and navies which transformed Carthage from a trading post into an empire. The African coast, except Utica, was conquered from Cyrenaica to Gibraltar and beyond. Tartessus, Gades, now Cadiz, and other Spanish towns were captured, and Carthage grew wealthy from the gold, silver, iron, and copper of Spain. It took the Balearic Islands and reached out even to Madeira. It conquered Malta, Sardinia, Corsica, and the western half of Sicily. It treated these subject lands with varying degrees of severity, charging them annual tribute, conscripting their population for its army, and strictly controlling their foreign relations and their trade. In return, it gave them military protection, local self-government, and economic stability. We may judge the wealth of these dependencies from the fact that the town of Leptis Minor paid 365 talents, or $1,314,000 a year, into the Carthaginian treasury. The exploitation of this empire and trade made Carthage, in the 3rd century BC, the richest of Mediterranean cities. Tariffs and tribute brought her annually 12,000 talents, 20 times the revenue of Athens at her zenith. The upper classes lived in palaces, wore costly robes, and ate exotic delicacies. The city, crowded with 250,000 inhabitants, became famous for its gleaming temples, its public baths, above all for its secure harbors and spacious docks. Each of the 220 docks was faced with 2 Ionic pillars, so that the inner harbor, or Kothon, presented a majestic circle of 440 marble columns. Thence a broad avenue led to the Forum, a colonnaded square adorned with Greek sculpture and containing administrative buildings, commercial offices, law courts, and temples, while the adjoining streets, orientally narrow, teemed with 1,000 shops plying 100 crafts and resounding with bargaining. Houses rose to 6 stories, and often crowded a family into a single room. In the center of the city, providing one of many hints to later builders of Rome, stood a hill or citadel, the Bursa. Here were the treasury and the mint, more shrines and colonnades, and the most brilliant of Carthaginian temples, to the great god Eshmun. Around the landward side of the city ran a 3-fold protective wall 45 feet high, with still higher towers and battlements. Within the wall were accommodations for 4,000 horses, 300 elephants, and 20,000 men. Outside the walls were the estates of the rich, and beyond these the fields of the poor. The Carthaginians were Semites, akin in blood and features to the ancient Jews. Their language now and then struck a Hebraic note, as when it called the chief magistrates shofetes, the Hebrew shofetim, or judges. The men grew beards, but usually shaved the upper lip with bronze razors. Most of them wore a fez or turban, shoes or sandals, and a long, loose gown. But the upper classes adopted the Greek style of dress, dyed their robes with purple, and fringed them with glass beads. The women led for the most part a veiled and secluded life. They could rise to high place in the priesthoods, but otherwise had to be contented with the sovereignty of their charms. Both sexes used jewelry and perfume, and occasionally displayed a ring in the nose. We know little of their morals except from their enemies. Greek and Roman writers described them as heavy eaters and drinkers, loving to gather in dinner clubs, and as loose in their sex relations as they were corrupt in their politics. The treacherous Romans employed fides punica, Carthaginian faith, as a synonym for treachery. Polybius reported that at Carthage nothing that results in profit is regarded as disgraceful. Plutarch denounced the Carthaginians as harsh and gloomy, docile to their rulers, hard to their subjects, running to extremes of cowardice in fear and of savagery in anger, stubborn in decisions, austere and unresponsive to amusement or the graces of life. But Plutarch, though usually fair, was always a Greek, and Polybius was bosom friend of the Scipio who burned Carthage to the ground. The Carthaginians appear at their worst in their religion, which again we know only from their enemies. Their ancestors in Phoenicia had worshipped Baal Moloch and Astarte as personifying the male and female principles in nature, and the sun and moon in the sky. The Carthaginians addressed similar devotions to corresponding deities, Baal Haman and Tanith. Tanith above all aroused their loving piety. They filled her temples with gifts and took her name in their oaths. Third in honor was the god Melkart, key of the city, then Eshmun, god of wealth and health, then a host of minor gods, Baals or lords. Even Dido was worshipped. To Baal Haman in great crises living children were sacrificed, as many as 300 in a day. They were placed upon the inclined and outstretched arms of the idol and rolled off into the fire beneath. Their cries were drowned in the noise of trumpets and cymbals. Their mothers were required to look upon the scene without moan or tear, lest they be accused of impiety and lose the credit due them from the god. In time, the rich refused to sacrifice their own children and bought substitutes among the poor, but when Agathocles of Syracuse besieged Carthage, the upper classes, fearing that their subterfuge had offended the god, cast 200 aristocratic infants into the fire. It should be added that these stories are told us by Diodorus, a Sicilian Greek, who looked with equanimity upon the Greek system of infanticide. It may be that the Carthaginian sacrifice solaced with piety, an effort to control the excesses of human fertility. While the Romans destroyed Carthage, they presented the libraries they found there to their African allies. Of these collections nothing survives except Hanno's record of his voyage, and fragments of Mago on husbandry. St. Augustine vaguely assured us that in Carthage there are many things wisely handed down to memory, and Sallust and Juba made use of Carthaginian historians, but we have no native account of Carthage's history. Of its architecture the Romans left not a stone upon a stone. We are told that its style was a mixture of Phoenician and Greek, that its temples were massive and ornate, that the temple and statue of Baal Haman were plated with gold valued at 1,000 talents, and that even the proud Greeks considered Carthage one of the world's most beautiful capitals. The museums of Tunis contain some pieces of sculpture from sarcophagi found in tombs near the site of Carthage. The finest is a strong and graceful figure, perhaps of Tanith, in a manner essentially Greek. Smaller statues, unearthed from Carthaginian graves in the Balears, are crude and often repulsively grotesque, as if designed to impress children or frighten devils away. The surviving pottery is purely utilitarian, but we know that Carthaginian craftsmen did good work in textiles, jewelry, ivory, ebony, amber, and glass. Any clear picture of Carthaginian government is now beyond our pens. Aristotle praised the constitution of Carthage as, in many respects, superior to all others, for a state is proved to be well ordered when the commons are steadily loyal to the constitution, when no civil conflict worth speaking of has arisen, and when no one has succeeded in making himself dictator. The citizens met occasionally in an assembly, empowered to accept or reject, but not to discuss or amend, proposals referred to it by a senate of 300 elders. The Senate, however, was not obliged to submit to the Assembly any measures upon which it could itself agree. The people elected the Senate, but open bribery reduced the virtue or danger of this democratic procedure and replaced an aristocracy of birth with an oligarchy of wealth. From nominations presented by the Senate, the Assembly annually chose 2 chauffetes to head the judicial and administrative branches of the state. Above all these bodies was a court of 104 judges who, in contravention of the law, held office for life. As it was empowered to supervise all administration and to require an accounting from every official at the end of his term, this court acquired, by the time of the Punic Wars, supreme control over every governmental agency and every citizen. The commander of the armies was nominated by the Senate and chosen by the Assembly. He was in a better position than the Roman consul, for his command could be continued as long as the Senate desired. The Roman, however, led against Carthage legions of landowning patriots, whereas the Carthaginian army was a mercenary force of foreign, chiefly Libyan origin, feeling no affection for Carthage but loyal only to its paymaster and, occasionally, to its general. The Carthaginian navy was without question the most powerful of its time. 500 quinquiremes, gaily painted, slim and swift, ably protected Carthaginian colonies, markets, and trade routes. It was the conquest of Sicily by this army and the closing of the western Mediterranean to Roman commerce by this navy that brought on the century-long duel to the death, known to us as the 3 Punic Wars. 2. Regulus. The 2 nations had once been friends when one of them was strong enough to dominate the other. In 508 they had made a treaty that recognized the hegemony of Rome over the coast of Latium, but pledged the Romans not to sail the Mediterranean west of Carthage, nor to land in Sardinia or Libya, except for the brief repair or provisioning of ships. It became a common practice among the Carthaginians, says a Greek geographer, to drown any foreign sailor found between Sardinia and Gibraltar. The Greeks of Massalia, now Marseille, had developed a peaceful coastal commerce between southern Gaul and northeastern Spain. Carthage, we are told, warred on this trade piratically, and Massalia was a faithful ally of Rome. We do not know how much of this is war propaganda dignified as history. Now that Rome controlled Italy, she could not feel secure so long as 2 hostile powers, Greeks and Carthaginians, held Sicily, hardly a mile from the Italian coast. Besides, Sicily was fertile. It might supply half of Italy with grain. Sicily taken, Sardinia and Corsica would of themselves fall into Roman hands. Here was manifest destiny, the natural next step in the expansion of Rome. How to find a casus belli? About 264 B.C., a band of Samnite mercenaries who called themselves Mamertines, that is, men of Mars, seized the town of Messana on the Sicilian coast nearest to Italy. They slew or expelled the Greek citizens, divided among themselves the women, children, and goods of the victims, and made a living by raiding the Greek cities nearby. Hiero II, dictator of Syracuse, besieged them. A Carthaginian force landed at Messana, drove Hiero back, and took possession of the city. The Mamertines appealed to Rome for help in expelling their saviors. The Senate hesitated, knowing the power and wealth of Carthage, but the rich plebeians who dominated the centurial assembly clamored for war and Sicily. Rome decided that at whatever cost she must keep the Carthaginians from so near and strategic a port. A fleet was fitted out and dispatched under Caius Claudius to rescue the Mamertines. But these had meanwhile been persuaded by the Carthaginians to withdraw their request for Roman aid, and a message from them to this effect reached Claudius at Rhegium. Ignoring it, he crossed the strait, invited the Carthaginian commander to a conference, imprisoned him, and sent word to the Carthaginian army that he would be killed if they resisted. The mercenaries welcomed so gallant an excuse for avoiding the legions, and Messena fell to Rome. Two heroes were thrown up by this First Punic War. On the Roman side, Regulus; on the Carthaginian, Hamilcar. Perhaps we should add a third and fourth, the Senate and the Roman people. The Senate won Hiero of Syracuse to Rome's side and thereby assured supplies for Roman troops in Sicily. It organized the nation with wisdom and resolution and led it to victory through almost overwhelming disasters. The citizens provided money, materials, labor, and men to build Rome's first fleet, 330 vessels, nearly all quinquiremes, 150 feet long, each manned by 300 rowers and 120 soldiers, and most of them equipped with novel grappling irons and movable gangways for seizing and boarding enemy ships. By these means, naval warfare, unfamiliar to the Romans, could be turned into hand-to-hand combat, in which the legionaries could use all their disciplined skill. This fact, says Polybius, shows us better than anything else how spirited and daring the Romans are when they are determined to do a thing. They had never given thought to a navy, yet when they had once conceived the project, they took it in hand so boldly that before gaining any experience in such matters, they at once engaged the Carthaginians, who for generations had held undisputed command of the sea. Off Ecnomus, on the southern coast of Sicily, the hostile fleets, carrying 300,000 men, fought the greatest sea battle of antiquity, this in 256. The Romans under Regulus won decisively and sailed on unhindered to Africa. Landing there without careful reconnaissance, they soon met a superior Carthaginian force, which almost annihilated them, and took their reckless consul prisoner. Shortly afterward, the Roman fleet was dashed by a storm against a rocky coast. 284 vessels were wrecked and some 80,000 men were drowned. It was the worst naval calamity in the memory of men. The Romans showed their quality by building 200 new quinquiremes in 3 months and training 80,000 men to man them. After keeping Regulus a prisoner for 5 years, his captors allowed him to accompany a Carthaginian embassy sent to Rome to seek peace, but on his promise to return to captivity if the Senate refused the proffered terms. When Regulus heard these, he advised the Senate to reject them and, despite the entreaties of his family and his friends, went back with the embassy to Carthage. There he was tortured to death by being prevented from sleeping. His sons at Rome took 2 Carthaginian captives of high rank, bound them in a chest studded with spikes, and kept them awake till they died. Neither tale seems credible until we recall the barbarities of our time. 3. Hamilcar. Of Hamilcars, Hasdrubals, and Hannibals, Carthage had an abundance, for these names were given in almost every generation in their oldest families. They were pious names, formed from those of the gods. Hamilcar was he whom Melkart protects. Hasdrubal was he whose help is Baal. Hannibal was the very grace of Baal. Our present Hamilcar was surnamed Barca, lightning. It was his nature to strike swiftly, suddenly, anywhere. He was still a youth when, in 247, Carthage gave him supreme command of its forces. Taking a small fleet, he harassed the coast of Italy with surprise landings, destroying Roman outposts and taking many prisoners. Then, in the face of a Roman army holding Panormus, now Palermo, he disembarked his troops and captured a height overlooking the town. His contingent was too small to risk a major engagement, but every time he led it forth it returned with spoils. He begged the Carthaginian Senate for reinforcements and supplies. It refused, hugged its hordes, and bade him feed and clothe his soldiers in the country that surrounded him. Meanwhile, the Roman fleet had won another victory, but had suffered a serious defeat at Drepana in 249. Worn out almost equally, the two nations rested for 9 years. But while in those years Carthage did nothing, relying upon the genius of Hamilcar, a number of Roman citizens voluntarily presented to the state a fleet of 200 men of war, carrying 60,000 troops. This new armada, sailing secretly, caught the Carthaginian fleet unprepared at the Egadian Isles off the west coast of Sicily, and so overwhelmed it that Carthage sued for peace in 241. Carthaginian Sicily was surrendered to Rome. An annual indemnity of 440 talents was pledged to Rome for 10 years, and all Carthaginian restrictions on Roman trade were withdrawn. The war had lasted nearly 24 years and had brought Rome so near to bankruptcy that its currency was debased 83%. But it had proved the irresistible tenacity of the Roman character and the superiority of an army composed of free men over mercenaries seeking the greatest booty for the least blood. Carthage was now to be all but destroyed by its own greed. It had withheld for some time the pay of its mercenaries, even of those who had served Hamilcar well. They poured into the city and demanded their money, and when the government temporized and tried to disperse them, they broke into mad revolt. Carthage's subject peoples, taxed beyond endurance during the war, joined the uprising, and the women of Libya sold their jewels to finance revolution. 20,000 mercenaries and rebels, led by Matho, a Libyan freeman, and Spendius, a Campanian slave, laid siege to Carthage at a time when hardly a soldier was there to defend it. The rich merchants trembled for their lives and appealed to Hamilcar to save them. Torn between affection for his mercenaries and his city, Hamilcar organized an army of 10,000 Carthaginians, trained them, led them forth, and raised the siege. The defeated mercenaries, retreating into the mountains, cut off the hands and feet of Jesco, a Carthaginian general, and 700 other prisoners, broke their legs, and then threw the still-living victims into an indiscriminate grave. Hamilcar maneuvered 40,000 of the rebels into a defile and blocked all exits so well that they began to starve. They ate their remaining captives, then their slaves. At last they sent Spendius to beg for peace. Hamilcar crucified Spendius and had hundreds of prisoners trampled to death under elephants' feet. The mercenaries tried to fight their way out but were cut to pieces. Matho was captured and was made to run through the streets of Carthage while the citizens beat him with thongs and tortured him till he died. This war of the mercenaries lasted 40 months, from 241 to 237, and was by far, said Polybius, the most bloody and impious war in history. When the conflict was over, Carthage found that Rome had occupied Sardinia. Carthage protested and Rome declared war. The desperate Carthaginians bought peace only by paying Rome an additional 1,200 talents and surrendering Sardinia and Corsica. We may judge the fury of Hamilcar at this treatment of his country. He proposed to his government that it should provide him with troops and funds to re-establish the power of Carthage in Spain as a stepping stone to an attack upon Italy. The landowning aristocracy opposed the plan, fearing further war. The mercantile middle class, resenting the loss of their foreign markets and ports, supported it. As a compromise, Hamilcar was given a modest contingent, with which he crossed to Spain in 238. He recaptured the cities whose allegiance to Carthage had lapsed during the war, built up his army with native recruits, financed and equipped it with the products of Spain's mines, and died while leading a charge against a Spanish tribe. This in 229. He left behind him in the camp his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and his sons Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago, his lion's brood. The son-in-law was chosen commander, and for 8 years governed wisely, winning the cooperation of the Spaniards and building near the silver mines a great city, known to Rome as Nova Carthago, or New Carthage, the Cartagena of today. When he was assassinated in 221, the army elected as its leader Hamilcar's eldest son Hannibal, then 26 years of age. Before leaving Carthage, his father had brought him, a boy of 9, to the altar of Baal Hammon, and had bidden him swear that someday he would revenge his country against Rome. Hannibal swore and did not forget. 4. Hannibal. Why had Rome permitted the reconquest of Spain? Because she was harassed with class strife, was expanding in the Adriatic, and was at war with the Gauls. In 232, a tribune, Caius Flaminius, foreshadowed the Gracchi by carrying through the assembly, against the violent opposition of the Senate, a measure distributing among the poor citizens some lands recently won from the Gauls. In 230, Rome took her first step toward the conquest of Greece by clearing the Adriatic of pirates and seizing a part of the Illyrian coast as a further protection for Italian trade. Safe now on south and east, she resolved to drive the Gauls over the Alps and make Italy a completely united state. To secure herself on the west, she signed a treaty with Hasdrubal, by which the Carthaginians in Spain agreed to stay south of the Ebro River, and at the same time she made an alliance with the semi-Greek towns of Saguntum and Amporius in Spain. In the following year, 225, a Gallic army of 50,000 foot and 20,000 horse swept down the peninsula. The inhabitants of the capital were so frightened that the Senate returned to the primitive custom of human sacrifice and buried 2 Gauls alive in the Forum as an appeasement of the gods. The legions met the invaders near Telamon, killed 40,000, took 10,000 prisoners, and marched on to subjugate all Cisalpine Gaul. In 3 years the task was completed. Protective colonies were established at Placentia and Cremona, and from the Alps to Sicily, Italy was won. It was an untimely victory. Had the Gauls been left unmolested for a few years more, they might have stopped Hannibal. But now all Gaul was aflame against Rome. Hannibal saw the opportunity he had longed for, to cross Gaul with little opposition and to invade Italy with Gallic tribes as his allies. The Punic leader was now 28 years old, at his prime in body and mind. In addition to a Carthaginian gentleman's schooling in the languages, literatures, and history of Phoenicia and Greece, he had received a soldier's training through 19 years in camp. He had disciplined his body to hardship, his appetite to moderation, his tongue to silence, his thought to objectivity. He could run or ride with the swiftest, hunt or fight with the bravest. He was the first to enter the battle, says the hostile Livy, and the last to abandon the field. The veterans loved him because in his commanding presence and piercing eyes they saw their old leader Hamilcar return to them in fresh youth. The recruits liked him because he wore no distinctive dress, never rested till he had provided for his army's needs, and shared with them all sufferings and gains. The Romans accused him of avarice, cruelty, and treachery, for he honored no scruples in seizing supplies for his troops, punished disloyalty severely, and laid many snares for his foes. Yet we find him often merciful, always chivalrous. Nothing occurs in the accounts of him, says the judicious Mommsen, which may not be justified under the circumstances and according to the international law of the times. The Romans could not readily forgive him for winning battles with his brains rather than with the lives of his men. The tricks he played upon them, the skill of his espionage, the subtlety of his strategy, the surprises of his tactics, were beyond their appreciation until Carthage was destroyed. In 219 BC, Roman agents organized in Saguntum a coup d'état that set up a government patriotically hostile to Carthage. When the Saguntines molested tribes friendly to him, Hannibal ordered them to desist. When they refused, he besieged the city. Rome protested to Carthage and threatened war. Carthage replied that since Saguntum was 100 miles south of the Ebro, Rome had no right to interfere, and had, by signing an alliance with it, violated her treaty with Hasdrubal. Hannibal persisted in the siege, and Rome took up arms again, never dreaming that this Second Punic War was to be the most terrible in her history. Hannibal spent 8 months in subduing the Saguntines. He did not dare advance toward Italy while leaving to the Romans so excellent a port for landing in his rear. In 218 he crossed the Ebro, challenging fate as Caesar would at the Rubicon. He had an army of 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry, none of them mercenaries, most of them Spaniards and Libyans. 3,000 Spaniards deserted when they learned that he planned to cross the Alps, and Hannibal released 7,000 others who protested against his enterprise as impossible. It was hard enough to force a passage through the Pyrenees. More unexpected was the fierce resistance of some Gallic tribes allied with Marseille. A summer of fighting was required to reach the Rhone, and a major battle to cross it. He had hardly left its banks when a Roman army arrived at the mouth of the river. Hannibal led his troops north toward Vienne and then struck eastward into the Alps. Celtic hordes had crossed those ranges before him, and he too might have done it without extraordinary hardship, had it not been for the hostility of the Alpine tribes and the difficulty of getting his elephants through narrow or precipitous passages. Early in September, after a climb of 9 days, he reached the summit and found it covered with snow. There he let his men and animals rest for 2 days and then began the downward march through passes steeper than the ascent, over roads sometimes buried by landslides and often paved with ice. Many soldiers and beasts lost their footing and tumbled to their deaths. Hannibal spurred on his despairing forces by pointing out to them in the distant south the green fields and sparkling streams of Italy. That paradise, he promised them, would soon be theirs. After 17 days in the Alps, they reached the plain and rested. So many men and horses had been lost in the crossing that the army was now reduced to 26,000, less than half the force that had left New Carthage 4 months before. Had the Cisalpine Gauls resisted him as the Transalpine Gauls had done, Hannibal's progress might have ended there. But the Boii and other tribes welcomed him as a savior and joined him as allies, while the recently established Roman settlers fled southward across the Po. Faced with this second threat in 7 years to the very life of Rome, the Senate mobilized all its resources and called upon the states of Italy to unite in the defense of their land. With their help, Rome raised armies totaling 300,000 foot, 14,000 horse, and 456,000 reserves. One army, under the first of many famous Scipios, met Hannibal along the Ticino, a small river flowing into the Po at Pavia. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry put the Romans to flight, and Scipio, dangerously wounded, was saved by the brave interposition of the son, who was destined to meet Hannibal again at Zama 16 years later. At Lake Trasimene, Hannibal encountered another Roman army, 30,000 strong, led by the tribune Caius Flaminius, and accompanied by slave dealers bringing fetters and chains for the prospective prisoners whom they hoped to sell. With part of his forces, Hannibal decoyed this army into a plain surrounded by hills and woods that concealed most of his troops. At his signal, the hidden columns debouched upon the Romans from every side and killed nearly all of them, including Flaminius himself. This in 217. Hannibal now controlled all northern Italy, but he knew that he was still outnumbered 10-1 by a resolute foe. His only hope lay in persuading at least some of the Italian states to revolt against Rome. He released all prisoners whom he had taken from Rome's allies, saying that he had come not to fight Italy, but to set it free. He marched through flooded Etruria, where for 4 days no dry land could be found on which to pitch a camp, crossed the Apennines to the Adriatic, and there allowed his soldiers a long interval to refresh their energies and heal their wounds. He himself suffered from severe ophthalmia, took no time to treat it, and lost the use of one eye. Then he marched down the eastern coast, inviting the Italian tribes to join him. None did. On the contrary, every city closed its gates against him and prepared to fight. As he moved south, his Gallic allies, interested only in their northern homes, began to desert him. Plots against his life were so numerous that he had to assume ever-new disguises. He begged his government to send him supplies and men by some Adriatic port. It refused. He asked his younger brother Hasdrubal, whom he had left in Spain, to organize an army and cross Gaul and the Alps to join him. But the Romans had invaded Spain, and Hasdrubal did not dare to leave it. 10 years were to pass before his coming. Rome now adopted against her greatest adversary his own baffling policy of caution and attrition. Quintus Fabius Maximus, made dictator in 217, created an adjective by delaying as long as he could a direct engagement with Hannibal. In time, he believed, the invaders would be reduced by hunger, discord, and disease. After a year, this masterly inaction irritated the Roman populace. The assembly overruled the Senate, as well as all precedents and logic, by electing Minucius Rufus co-dictator with Fabius. Against Fabius's advice, Minucius advanced against the enemy, fell into a trap, was severely beaten, and thereafter understood why Hannibal said that he feared Fabius, who would not fight, more than Marcellus, who would. A year later, Fabius was deposed, and the Roman armies were entrusted to Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Caius Terentius Varro. Paulus, the aristocrat, counseled caution. Varro, of the plebs, was all for action. And as usual, caution lost the argument. Varro sought and found the Carthaginians at Cannae, in Apulia, some 10 miles from the Adriatic coast. The Romans had 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry. Hannibal had 19,000 veterans, 16,000 unreliable Gauls, 10,000 horse, and he had lured Varro to fight in a broad plain ideal for cavalry. He had placed the Gauls at his center, expecting that they would give way. They did, and when the Romans followed them into the pocket, the subtle Carthaginian, himself in the thick of the fray, ordered his veterans to close in upon the Roman flanks and bade his cavalry smash through the opposed horsemen to attack the legions from behind. The Roman army was surrounded, lost all chance of maneuvering, and was almost annihilated. 44,000 of them fell, including Paulus and 80 senators who had enlisted as soldiers. 10,000 escaped to Canusium, among them Varro and the Scipio, who was to win the surname of Africanus Maior. This in 216. Hannibal lost 6,000 men, 2/3 of them Gauls. It was a supreme example of generalship, never bettered in history. It ended the days of Roman reliance upon infantry and set the lines of military tactics for 2,000 years. 5. Scipio. The disaster shattered Rome's hegemony in southern Italy. Samnites, Bruttians, Lucanians, Metapontum, Thurii, Crotona, Locri, and Capua joined Cisalpine Gaul in attaching themselves to Hannibal. Only Umbria, Latium, and Etruria remained firm. Hiero of Syracuse was loyal to the death, but his successors declared for Carthage. Philip V of Macedon, fearful of Roman expansion through Illyria into the east, allied himself with Hannibal and declared war upon Rome. Carthage herself became interested and sent Hannibal meager reinforcements and supplies. Some of the young Roman nobles among the survivors at Canusium thought the situation hopeless and meditated flight to Greece. But Scipio shamed them into courage. Rome was for a month hysterical with terror. Only a small garrison remained to protect it against Hannibal. Matrons of high family ran weeping to the temples, and cleansed with their hair the statues of the gods. Some whose husbands and sons had fallen in battle cohabited with foreigners and slaves, lest their strain should die. To regain the favor of obviously offended deities, the Senate again sanctioned human sacrifice, and buried alive 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks. But the Romans, says Polybius, were most to be feared when they stood in real danger. Though they were now so overwhelmingly defeated, and their military reputation had been destroyed, yet by the peculiar virtues of their constitution and by wise counsel, they not only recovered their supremacy in Italy, but in a few years made themselves masters of the world. The class war ceased, and all groups rushed to the rescue of the state. Taxes had already risen apparently beyond tolerance, but now the citizens, even widows and children, voluntarily brought their secret savings to the treasury. Every male who could bear arms was called to the colors, slaves were accepted in the levies and were promised freedom in the event of victory. Not a single soldier would consent to receive pay. Rome prepared to contest every inch of ground against the new lion of Carthage. But Hannibal did not come. His 40,000 men were too small a force, he thought, to besiege a city to whose defense many armies would converge from still loyal states. And if he took it, how could he hold it? His Italian allies, instead of strengthening, weakened him. Rome and her friends were raising forces to attack them, and without his help they would succumb. His aides reproached his caution, and one of them remarked sadly, "The gods have not given all their gifts to one man. You know how to win victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use it." Hannibal decided to wait till Carthage, Macedon, and Syracuse could unite with him in a multiple offensive that would retake Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Illyria, and compel Rome to confine her power to Italy. He released all captives except Romans, and offered these to Rome for a small ransom. When the Senate refused this, he sent most of them to Carthage as slaves, and forced the rest, in Roman style, to amuse his men by gladiatorial combats, even to the death. He besieged and took several towns, and then led his army to winter in Capua. It was the most pleasant and dangerous place that he could have chosen, for this second city of Italy, some 12 miles north of Naples, had learned from the Etruscans and the Greeks the vices as well as the graces of civilization, and Hannibal's troops felt entitled to indulge for a season the flesh that had borne so many hardships and wounds. They were never again the invincible soldiers who had through many campaigns been formed in their master's Spartan image. In the next 5 years Hannibal led them to some minor successes, but while they were so engaged the Romans laid siege to Capua. Hannibal sought to relieve it by marching to within a few miles of Rome. The Romans raised 25 new legions, 200,000 men, and Hannibal, still limited to 40,000, retired to the south. In 211 Capua fell. Its leaders, who had let loose a massacre of Romans in the city, were beheaded or committed suicide, and the population which had strongly supported Hannibal was dispersed throughout Italy. A year before, Marcellus had taken Syracuse, and a year later Agrigentum yielded to Rome. Meanwhile, a Roman army under the 2 older Scipios had been sent to Spain to keep Hasdrubal occupied. They defeated him at the Ebro in 215, but both of them were soon afterward killed in battle, and their gains were being lost when their son and nephew, Scipio Africanus, was dispatched to the Spanish command. He was but 24, far below the legal age for so responsible a position. But the Senate was willing to stretch the Constitution to save the state, and the Assembly was by this time voluntarily subordinating itself to the Senate. The people admired him not only because he was handsome and eloquent, intelligent and brave, but pious, courteous, and just. It was his custom, before undertaking an enterprise, to commune with the gods in the temples on the Capitol, and after his victories to reward them with hecatombs. He believed, or represented himself to be a favorite of heaven. His successes spread the belief and filled his followers with confidence. He soon restored discipline among the troops, captured Nova Carthago after a long siege, and scrupulously turned over to the treasury the precious metal and stones that there fell into his hands. Most of the Spanish cities surrendered to him, and by 205 Spain had become a Roman province. Nevertheless, Hasdrubal's main force had escaped and now crossed Gaul and the Alps into Italy. The young leader's message to Hannibal was intercepted, and his plan of campaign was revealed to Rome. A Roman army met his modest force at the Metaurus River in 207 and defeated him despite his excellent generalship. Seeing the battle lost and all hope of reaching his brother gone, Hasdrubal leaped into the midst of the legions and took death in his stride. The Roman historians, perhaps romancing, tell us that the victor cut off the youth's head and sent it through Apulia to be cast over the ramparts into Hannibal's camp. Broken in spirit by the fate of a brother whom he had dearly loved, Hannibal withdrew his thinned-out forces to Bruttium. No action was fought with him this year, says Livy, nor did the Romans care to disturb him, so great was the reputation of his powers, even while his cause was everywhere round him crumbling into ruin. Carthage sent him 100 ships laden with men and food, but a gale drove the vessels to Sardinia, where a Roman fleet sank or captured 80 of them. The rest fled home. In 205, young Scipio, fresh from his victories in Spain, was chosen consul, raised a new army, and sailed for Africa. The Carthaginian government appealed to Hannibal to come to the help of the city that had so long refused to support him. How shall we imagine the feelings of the half-blind warrior, driven into a corner of Italy by an endless stream of enemies, seeing all his toil and hardships of 15 years brought to nothing, and all his triumphs summing up to futility and flight? Half of his troops refused to embark with him for Carthage. According to hostile historians, he had 20,000 of them killed for disobedience, and for fear that Rome might add them to her legions. Touching his native soil after an absence of 36 years, he hastily formed a new army and went out to face Scipio at Zama, 50 miles south of Carthage, this in 202. The two generals met in a courteous interview, found agreement impossible, and joined battle. For the first time in his life, Hannibal was defeated. The Carthaginians, mostly mercenaries, gave ground before the Roman infantry and the reckless cavalry of Massinissa, the Numidian king. 20,000 Carthaginians were left dead on the field. Hannibal, now 45, fought with the energy of youth, attacked Scipio in personal combat and wounded him, attacked Massinissa, reformed his disordered forces again and led them in desperate countercharges. When all hope fled, he eluded capture, rode to Carthage, announced that he had lost not only a battle but the war, and advised the Senate to sue for peace. Scipio was generous. He allowed Carthage to retain her African empire, but demanded the surrender of all her war vessels except 10 triremes. She was not to make war outside of Africa or within it without Rome's consent, and she was to pay Rome 200 talents, or $720,000, every year for 50 years. Hannibal pronounced the terms just and persuaded his government to accept them. The Second Punic War changed the face of the western Mediterranean. It gave Spain and all its wealth to Rome, providing the funds for the Roman conquest of Greece. It reunited Italy under Rome's unquestioned mastery and threw open all routes and markets to Roman ships and goods. But it was the most costly of all ancient wars. It ravaged or injured half the farms of Italy, destroyed 400 towns, killed 300,000 men. Southern Italy has never quite recovered from it to this day. It weakened democracy by showing that a popular assembly cannot wisely choose generals or direct a war. It began the transformation of Roman life and morals by hurting agriculture and helping trade, by taking men from the countryside and teaching them the violence of battle and the promiscuity of the camp, by bringing the precious metals of Spain to finance new luxuries and imperialistic expansion, and by enabling Italy to live on the extorted wheat of Spain, Sicily, and Africa. It was a pivotal event for almost every phase of Roman history. To Carthage it was the beginning of the end. With much of its commerce and empire left to it, it might have solved the problems of regeneration. But the oligarchical government was so corrupt that it threw upon the lower classes the burden of raising the annual indemnity for Rome and embezzled part of it to boot. The popular party called upon Hannibal to come out of his retirement and save the nation. In 196 he was elected suffete. He shocked the oligarchs by proposing that the judges of the Court of 104 should be elected for 1 year and should be ineligible for a second term until after a year's interval. When the Senate rejected the measure, he brought it before the Assembly and carried it. By this law and this procedure, he established at one stroke a degree of democracy equal to Rome's. He punished and checked venality and pursued it to its source. He relieved the citizens of the extra taxes that had been laid upon them, and yet so managed the finances that by 188 Carthage was able to pay off the Roman indemnity in full. To get rid of him, the oligarchy secretly sent word to Rome that Hannibal was plotting to renew the war. Scipio used all his influence to protect his rival, but was overruled. The Senate accommodated the rich Carthaginians by demanding the surrender of Hannibal. The old warrior fled by night, rode 150 miles to Thapsus, and there took ship to Antioch, this in 195. He found Antiochus III hesitating between war and peace with Rome. He advised war and became one of the king's staff. When the Romans defeated Antiochus at Magnesia in 189, they made it a condition of peace that Hannibal should be turned over to them. He escaped first to Crete, then to Bithynia. The Romans hunted him out and surrounded his hiding place with soldiers. Hannibal preferred death to capture. "Let us," he said, "relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." He drank the poison that he carried with him and died, aged 67, in the year 184 BC. A few months later his conqueror and admirer, Scipio, followed him to peace.